Welcome to the deep dive. This is where you give us your stack of source material, could be articles, notes, anything really, and we pull out the key insights, the really fascinating stuff.
Exactly. It's about cutting through the noise. And the stack for this dive. It's incredibly broad. We're touching on everything from, naval strategy and tech,
Right up to international law, how policy gets made.
even specific tools for analysis, pestle, spear, things like that.
So it's a real journey from the, let's say, tactical edge, right up to the big strategic picture and the global context. Our job today is to help you connect those dots.
Find the threads between the hardware, the people, the policies, the international rules. It's all linked.
Okay, let's dive in then. We're kicking off with some really current military observations, lessons learned, basically.
Yeah, straight into it. The sources point immediately to U.S. Navy experiences, like in the Red Sea recently, and a major challenge being flagged is, well, the missile expenditure.
Something like 220 missiles used. That figure jumped out.
It did. And the immediate follow-on concern is magazine depth. Can you replenish fast enough? What does this mean if you're facing, say, a peer competitor like China?
That cost exchange ratio seems brutal.
It really does, but interestingly, the sources also show tactical adaptation happening, like right there on the scene.
You mean like the USS O'Kane? Using its deck gun?
Its 5-inch gun, yeah, against UAVs. And maybe even more striking, a Navy helicopter, an MH-60R, apparently shooting down a drone. The source called it a likely first for that helicopter type.
Wow. And fighters off the carriers hitting missiles, too.
It shows they're not just sitting ducks. They're figuring out ways to use what they have against these newer, cheaper threats, even while that bigger inventory question looms.
Okay, so let's flip that. What are the sources saying about China's Navy, the plan? There was that CMSI translation looking at lessons they might be drawing from these kinds of conflicts.
Right. A key recommendation coming out of that analysis is about integrating intelligent autonomous systems.
Autonomy again.
Yeah, the thinking seems to be that humans have limits in maintaining that super high-intensity readiness, so maybe autonomous systems can help shoulder some of that load.
And it's not just bolting things onto current ships, is it? They're talking about future designs.
Exactly. Designing future warships specifically to counter these diverse, low-cost threats like UAVs right from the drawing board.
Makes sense. And for the current fleet,
Oh.
any specific upgrades mentioned?
Oh, yeah. Things like dedicated UAV jamming systems, these things called jamming bombs, targeting optical and IR sensors, even lasers for physically destroying drone components.
So very targeted counter-UAV stuff. It feels like a direct response to what's happening globally.
Absolutely. And the source flat out says, integrating manned ships and unmanned equipment could, quote, open a new chapter for their maritime ops.
A new chapter. That signals a pretty fundamental shift, doesn't it?
It does, towards unmanned systems as a core capability, not just an add-on. They also apparently emphasize ship mobility, using wide maneuvers to avoid getting pinned down.
Okay, so it's tech and tactics. But what about the fundamentals? Did the sources touch on things like readiness, training for the plan?
They did. There's discussion about improving damage control. Apparently, a recent review of damage control plans across their warships found some problems.
So they're working on the basics, too.
Yes, the source even gives guidance on how individual ships should develop their own plans and details the process. It shows a sort of systematic approach to shoring up a core skill.
And the people side, training, personnel.
Crucial. The sources mention the Dalian Naval Vessel Academy quite a bit.
The cradle of naval officers.
That's the term used. Trained over 50,000 officers since 1949, and get this, over 80% of planned ship captains reportedly attended it.
80%, that's huge. What do they teach there?
14 specializations listed. Everything from damage control, very hands-on, to things like Navy foreign affairs etiquette.
Etiquette, interesting. So technical skills and how to represent China abroad.
Seems like it. The sources even sketch out a typical career path. Deputy department head, then department head, XO, captain, with estimated timelines like maybe 13 years to make department head.
Gives you a feel for their pipeline. Were there any interviews?
Yeah, one mentioned was with an acting captain, served on 7 ships, 3 different classes, and apparently he echoed Xi Jinping's call for a world-class Navy.
Acting captain. The source flagged that term as needing more clarity.
It did. It suggests maybe temporary roles or different command structures than we might assume. An interesting little detail.
Okay, let's go deeper. Submarines. There was that translated interview with a former planned submarine officer. talking about SSBNs.
Right, they're strategic nuclear subs.
Yeah.
He discussed achieving continuous readiness duty.
Meaning what exactly? Always having one out there.
Essentially, yeah.
Wow.
Maintaining that sea-based leg of their nuclear triad, 20M47, it means having the boats, the trained crews, the command and control all lined up so at least one SSBN is constantly at sea on deterrent patrol.
That's a huge undertaking. Did the source give specifics?
Some fascinating ones. Details on SSBN communications always tricky underwater, and it specifically called out acoustic vulnerabilities.
For the Type 094 design.
Exactly. Which is a big deal for an SSBN. Its whole job is to be quiet and hide. If it's noisy,
It's easier to track. Undermines the mission.
precisely. The source even put numbers on it. That need at least 4 SSBNs to guarantee one is always on patrol, but 6 gives you better redundancy.
4 minimum, 6 preferred. And the human factor.
Definitely mention. Psychological, physiological limits mean crews need rotation. That's why they use multiple crews per boat, aiming for at least 2 boats and 4 crews capable. It underscores the intensity of maintaining that posture.
Okay, switching theaters now. Taiwan. The sources talked about mine warfare.
Yes, Taiwan's capabilities and how the PLA might think about countering them.
What's Taiwan's angle?
Their research suggests mining coastal waters could make any PLA landing plan extremely complicated. Basically, disrupt the plan, sow chaos, force landing craft into predictable channels.
Where they're sitting ducks for missiles. And damaged ships become obstacles.
Exactly. Collisions, blocking channels, just making a mess of any amphibious assault timeline.
So how does the PLA plan to deal with that, according to these sources?
A lot of focus on intel and preemption. Peacetime surveillance of Taiwan's mine-laying infrastructure where they store them, build them, stage them.
And if conflict starts?
Firepower strikes, targeting everything in that mine-laying chain. Storage, factories, transport, the ships laying the mines. Try to take it out before it becomes a problem.
Makes sense. Now, speaking of underwater threats and tech, UUVs came up again, right? Unmanned underwater vehicles.
Big theme. Autonomous tech is called the most dynamic frontier. Improving their smarts, their decision-making, is seen as inevitable.
How do they compare them to manned subs for attack?
Well, the sources weigh the pros and cons. A key point seems to be a greater willingness to accept risk with UUVs.
Because no sailors are on board.
Presumably, you can send them on riskier missions. The sources even get into the weeds of using machine learning for UUV torpedo attacks.
Really? Like AI torpedoes?
Sort of. Applying machine learning to help the UUV make decisions during an attack, dealing with uncertain data, reacting in real time, improving how it senses the environment. It shows they're tackling the really hard engineering problems.
Okay, so that's a good look at the sort of military, operational, and tech side. But those decisions, what to build, how to adapt, they don't happen in a vacuum. Let's zoom out now to strategy and policymaking.
Right. How do nations actually decide what to do? The sources really hammer home that national interests are the bedrock, the absolute foundation.
Statesmen think and act in terms of interest. That quote stood out.
It's the guidepost. Interests determine how much attention you pay to something, whether it's a challenge or an opportunity. But the tricky part, the sources note, is gauging the intensity. How vital is this interest?
So prioritizing becomes key. The difference between vital interests, things you might fight for, and important interests, where maybe you compromise.
Exactly. Vital for survival or well-being, important or significant, but maybe not worth going to war over. And the sources show how the focus of U.S. interests has shifted dramatically over time.
From the Cold War focus.
Superpower rivalry, yeah. To the post-Cold War world dealing with trade, democracy, ethnic conflicts, failed states, then terrorism, WMDs.
And post 9/11 seemed like a real inflection point in the sources.
Yeah.
Because the threats changed.
Yeah, they talk about these sovereignty-free threats, terrorism, crime networks, pandemics, things that don't respect borders, don't fit neatly into state versus state models.
So you need different approaches, which means understanding how policy actually gets made in this messy environment.
Messy is a good word. The sources describe the U.S. national security community as a morass of intersecting relationships. It's complex.
The executive branch carries the main load, but it's not alone. You've got all these other players clamoring for influence.
Like Congress. Big player. The sources point out that reforms back in the 70s creating the CBO for independent analysis, boosting staff gave Congress way more power to challenge the president on foreign policy.
That historical struggle between the president and Congress over foreign policy direction.
It's a constant dynamic. And then outside government, you have think tanks.
The idea generators.
Right. Free from bureaucracy, they can challenge assumptions, translate complex problems into policy options. They become influential gatekeepers of information in this age of overload.
And interest groups, too, focusing on specific issues.
Yeah, from broad concerns to very narrow ones. With that dynamic of small, motivated groups versus larger, maybe less intensely focused groups.
Okay, within the executive branch itself, the interagency process, the NSC system.
The National Security Council, Principals Committee, Deputies Committee, Policy Coordination Committees, this whole structure is meant to coordinate policy across departments 24/7.
But it creates its own power dynamics, right? The National Security Advisor running the staff, competing with state defense.
Definitely. And the sources are frank about the challenges. The system is sometimes called broken or fragmented. Factors like groupthink, strong personalities, departments getting bypassed. It happens.
Despite efforts to centralize.
Yeah. There's a key quote, basically an iron rule. No major national security issue gets solved by just one agency. They need each other. Functional interdependence.
Another challenge flagged was planning culture. Less ingrained outside of DoD.
That's what the sources suggest. Civilian agencies might not have that same deep-rooted planning process focus that you see in the military.
Which makes coordination harder, especially for military leaders working with civilian agencies or NGOs who just operate differently.
Absolutely. Understanding that institutional landscape is critical for anyone in a strategic leadership role.
This leads nicely into a really key distinction the sources make. Policy versus strategy. Related, but different.
Tightly related. They must be aligned, aiming for the exact same goal or end state. Policy sets the direction, the what and why.
And strategy is the how.
Right. Strategy develops the ways, the courses of action, and identifies the means, the resources, like forces, money, people, to achieve the policy goal. Policy can also set limits or preferences on those ways and means.
And crucially, policy approval is needed for the strategy itself, not just the overall goal.
That's what the sources stress. The specific ways and means outlined in the strategy need that policy-level buy-in.
So, when you're weighing different policy options, how do you assess them? The sources mentioned a FR test.
Feasibility, acceptability, and risk. FAR.
Okay, feasibility sounds straightforward. Can you actually do it?
Yeah. Do you have the resources, military power, economic clout, diplomatic leverage, whatever's needed from your national power and the time?
Acceptability seems more complex.
It is. Is the policy proportional? Is the expected benefit worth the likely cost? Does it comply with laws, domestic and international? Is it politically sustainable, both at home and abroad? Militarily supportable?
And the sources broke down cost, didn't they? Not just money.
Right. Material cost? Sure. Physical impact. But also political cost, losing support, and moral cost, casualties, breaking laws, losing legitimacy. That combined political moral cost is a good indicator of legitimacy.
Okay, FA, then risk.
Assessing the probability of bad things happening and how bad they'd be if they did. What if multiple risks occur together? Can you mitigate them?
And thinking beyond the immediate effects.
Super important. Analyzing second and third order effects, those unintended consequences, good or bad, that ripple outwards. Asking questions like, what could opponents do to spoil this plan? What don't we know? Those are key risk assessment steps.
Okay, so that's the national level. Let's zoom out one more time to the international system. Laws, norms, or lack thereof.
International law. The sources define it as that body of rules states consent to be bound by, treaties, customs.
Essential for things like trade, environment, regulating how states behave. But focused on states? Traditionally.
Historically, yes. And the whole system is built on state sovereignty, supreme authority within borders. But, as the sources point out, globalization, international cooperation, non-state actors, they're all challenging that traditional idea.
The post-World War II era was a major shift, wasn't it? With the UN, Nuremberg.
Huge shift. The message was, aggressive war is unacceptable, and individuals can be held responsible for atrocities, not just states.
Which eventually led to the International Criminal Court, the ICC.
Right. A permanent court for the most serious crimes, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity when national courts can't or won't act.
But the sources noted challenges for the ICC. U.S. non-participation, for one.
Yeah, the U.S. isn't a party. Concerns were cited about U.S. soldiers potentially facing prosecution, though the sources argue that risk might be overstated. There's also the need for these Article 98 agreements.
To protect U.S. personnel in coalition ops from ICC surrender requests.
Exactly. And the sources do mention complaints have been filed regarding U.S. actions in Iraq and Afghanistan since the ICC started.
So there's debate about its relevance versus its potential value for, say, prosecuting pirates or terrorists.
Definitely a debate presented. It highlights that fundamental tension. National sovereignty versus international law and cooperation. Is unilateral action sometimes better, or do you need institutions for lasting order? The U.S. creating multilateral bodies after WWII is given as an example of building order through cooperation.
But the bottom line argument seemed to be that some global accountability mechanism is needed.
Yeah, because some states just can't or won't prosecute perpetrators of major crimes. Upholding the rule of law globally is seen as indispensable for that reason.
The sources also brought up just war theory,
A traditional framework for the ethics of war.
those ad bellum criteria before going to war, just cause, legitimate authority.
Public declaration, just intent, proportionality, last resort, reasonable hope of success. It's meant to be a high bar.
A very high bar. Though the sources noted states use the language, but maybe not always, honestly.
That's often the criticism, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The sources also briefly touched on different religious views: Hebrew Bible, early Christianity's pacifism versus state force debate, Islam, and jihad.
And the concept of lawfare, using law as a weapon.
Yeah, a couple of angles on that. One perspective frames it as that tension between global norms, like those pushed by the ICC, and core national interests and values, an argument against prioritizing a sort of collective conscience over national principles.
And the other angle related to rules of engagement.
Right. Arguing that judging the reasonableness of force used by someone in combat or a tense situation has to be done from their perspective at that moment, not with perfect hindsight. Similar, the source notes to how U.S. courts look at domestic law enforcement actions.
Which connects back to those new threats we discussed earlier, the transnational or sovereignty-free ones.
Terrorism, WMD proliferation, crime, drugs, pandemics, environmental issues. The argument is that traditional state-centric militaries aren't really set up for these non-governmental, borderless challenges.
And these threats can directly hit U.S. interests by destabilizing other countries, like drug violence in Mexico.
Exactly. Or organized crime undermining democracy somewhere important.
The sources gave specific maritime examples, too. Smuggling in sea freight, fraudulent documents.
Just the sheer volume of shipping makes it hard to catch sophisticated smugglers.
They mentioned interdiction efforts requiring cooperation, like seizing cocaine needed multiple agencies working together.
Yeah, OAM and BESS were mentioned, highlighting that interagency point again.
And interestingly, the potential ongoing need for the military, like the National Guard, to help with maritime border security.
Framed as a recurring anomaly from the post-9/11 world. DHS and CBP are building capabilities, but the source questions if they can handle the upper-end threat alone. It really shows how these new threats blur traditional roles. And just briefly, the sources also dipped into a couple of historical examples and analytical tools.
Like the Washita campaign and Little Bighorn, as examples of past Army failures.
Yeah, highlighting factors like logistics problems and fundamentally misunderstanding the situation on the ground, historical lessons.
And tools like PESTLE analysis.
Right. Political, economic, sociological, technological, legal, environmental. A framework for scanning that big external picture that might affect you.
And SPR for sustainability appraisals.
Yeah, using indicators and scoring to assess how sustainable a project is. Just examples of structured thinking tools.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what's the takeaway from this deep dive? We've covered a huge amount of ground.
We really have, from, naval tactics in the Red Sea and plan modernization, through the complexities of how Washington makes policy.
Into international law, ethics, just war.
And these new transnational threats. It's clear that understanding global security means looking at all these different pieces. You can't just focus on the tech or just the policy or just the law.
They're all connected. The details of a submarine's acoustics matter, but so do the dynamics inside the NSC, and so do the debates around the ICC.
Exactly. This dive shows how pulling together information from all these different kinds of sources helps you build that more complete, nuanced picture.
It really does. The challenges are interconnected.
And what I found really fascinating running through all this material is this underlying tension.
How so?
Well, the sources show governments grappling with today's problems, obviously,
Yeah.
but they also reveal this deeper friction trying to apply old concepts, ideas like sovereignty or just war theory that were mostly built for states dealing with other states.
To this new world. A world with powerful non-state actors, diffuse threats, global problems that ignore borders.
Precisely. The traditional tools and concepts are being stretched, maybe even broken, by this changing environment. It requires constant rethinking, constant adaptation.
So maybe a final thought for you to consider as you do your own dives. How do those internal government complexities, we talked about the interagency politics, the different ways agencies plan or don't plan, how does all that internal stuff actually affect a nation's ability to deal effectively with those external sovereignty-free challenges, or to navigate that tricky balance between its own interests and, say, global accountability?
It's a great question. How much does the internal machinery enable or maybe hinder effective action in this really complex modern world? Something to definitely chew on.